Hello, friends. Welcome to Ents and Sensibility, the podcast for everyone who loves bold, witty women, awkward, handsome men, and dragons. I'm your host, Casey Meserve. Together, we're exploring Jane Austen's novels one chapter at a time, doing close readings, looking at sources, talking about Jane's life and influences, and looking at new remixes of these classic novels, especially those with a sci-fi or fantasy flair. I hope you enjoy the journey. Well, it's been a long while since the last episode, and to paraphrase Dr. Malcolm, life gets in the way. Anyways, I'm back, and I have a fun episode for you today. First of all, we have a surprise interview. The author of Once Persuaded, Twice Shy, a sweet new novel based on Jane Austen's Persuasions. Welcome, Melodie Edwards. Melodie, tell me, first off, welcome to Ents and Sensibility. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you became an author, and who your favorite and most hated Austen characters are?
Well, thanks very much for having me on. So my name is Melodie Edwards. I live in Toronto, Ontario, out here in Canada, and I work in communications. So a very different kind of writing, press releases and whatnot. And back in 2020, I wrote my first book, which was Jane and Edward, and it was a modern reimagining of Jane Eyre set in Toronto. And I was very lucky that got me an agent and a publishing deal with Berkeley, which is part of Penguin Random House. And my second book, which is coming out at the end of February, is called Once Persuaded, Twice Shy. And that's a modern reimagining of Persuasion set in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is a lovely little historical town here in Ontario, right near the American border. Oh, and favorite Austen characters, least favorite. That's really difficult. Um, I think my favorite Austen character, if it's not Anne Elliot, then it's probably Mr. Bennet. And my least favorite character, it's probably the whole cast from Northanger Abbey. I mean, besides Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland, I mean, the rest of the cast.
They're all pretty terrible.
They're all terrible and they're in terribly realistic ways. I mean, we like to laugh at Mr. Cullen and we can pity Willoughby, but when I read Northanger Abbey, I'm like, these people are all horrible, but in very realistic ways.
Yeah, I agree. They really, really are. I think Mr. Bennet might be my most hated character because he had one job. One job.
Yeah, that's fair. He's not without his flaws. He really lets his family down, but I like his sort of background narrator wisdom. Like, we're here to laugh at each other. It's fine. I'm going to my library now.
So we're here to actually talk about your newest book, and I really did enjoy it. I thought it
Oh,
was really
God, thank
sweet.
you.
I loved the location. So tell me a little bit about the book. How did the idea of a modern retelling of Persuasion come about, and why you chose Niagara on the Lake as a location? It's a beautifully described location.
Gorgeous to visit. I didn't even quite capture it, I don't think. So I'd finished my Jane Eyre retelling, reimagining, and I was talking to my editor, and I had a 2-book deal, so I owed them a second book, and they were really quite keen on another reimagining. And my undergrad degree is in English literature, so I was like, great, let me go back into my essays. What have I got? And we threw around some ideas. You know, I love Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. I love Middlemarch. I love a lot of those. But she was saying, you know, the great romances. I'm like, well, then you've got to go back to Austen. And there was kind of a lot of buzz around Persuasion at the time. I think they had a couple of movies scheduled in the future. They hadn't come out yet when I was writing this. And Persuasion is actually my favorite Austen. I was just a little concerned about how I was going to do it because modern romances so often you get the characters together, kind of at the halfway point and then you break them up. And it's really tough with Austen's Persuasion because they're already broken up
Right.
and they're not even talking to each other till about 2/3 of the way through the book. And I'm like, is this going to be too slow for modern audiences? there's so little, interaction between them. It's just so much like tense suffering and silence. But I really wanted to give it a try. I was really keen on it. I love the book so much. And then I thought, okay, I need a setting that'll give me some forced proximity, and I need a setting that's a little bit claustrophobic, but I can keep them together. Because, in Jane Austen's time, it's like, well, yes, you're here for this dinner party, and so you know that you'll be there visiting for the weekend, and that's just how it is. But in modern days, we'd say, if that's your ex and you're not getting along, like, walk away. So I
Mhm.
needed something to trap them together. And at the same time, I wanted a location that had a lot of activity. So because they're not talking to each other, there's lots of other things I could fill the book with, enjoyable things that people might want to read about. And so because I live in Toronto, Niagara is just like an hour and a bit drive for me. I go all the time for the weekend. It's absolutely lovely. And, I was going a lot in the pandemic because there's a lot of outdoor things to do. And I thought, this is perfect. This is a small town feel, but there's so much activity because it's tourist town. There's the theater, there's the shopping, there's the spa and the golf course and everything. Like it's so, so full. There's so many characters. And I just thought this is a beautiful, romantic place for them to fall back in love with each other as well. There's lots of, particularly in the fall, which is when I said it, there's lots of scenery posing under the autumn leaves that I thought would be rather nice for our poor silently suffering Anne Elliot.
She does suffer silently. Now this Anne Elliot has it from an outside perspective. She's got it together. She's got this amazing job. She's got this great family. Her dress, like the first time you see her in that narrow little pencil skirt and the Louboutins, I can't pronounce the word, so I apologize. And she's rushing to deal with this frantic, highly strung actress, and you're like, "This is Anne Elliot? This is our one little petite Anne Elliot from Persuasion?" It's Anne Elliot, but it is a modern Anne Elliot who is just holding all of these things together, but then you find out maybe she's not holding everything together as well as we all and she thinks. Tell me a little bit about your modern Anne and how you created her as to be similar but different from the original Anne Elliot.
That was tough because I think this is why we go with my editor goes with the term reimaginings and retellings because I do wander a bit far afield sometimes. It's so tough because I so love these characters and Jane Austen's so brilliantly created them. They're so psychologically complex. They're just really 3D characters. But a lot of how they express themselves and the restrictions on them are very much of Jane Austen's time. Like Anne Elliot is unmarried, has to live with her father and her sister, no prospects. Like, what else is there for her to do as an unmarried woman? But in modern times, there's lots for an unmarried woman to do, right? There's lots of us unmarried, and there's lots of opportunities. So the thing I tried to do is I looked at what is the core of Anne Elliot. She's hyper competent, even with the restrictions on her in Jane Austen's time, right? Like when they're talking about the debt and the estate, she's the one who says, well, I'll drop, this is the budget we need to get out of the red. And then when that doesn't work, she's the one who kind of shuts down the house and says goodbye to the servants and says goodbye to the tenants and packs up. Like she takes care of everything. And then she has to go out to her sister Mary and she has to calm Mary down and get her brother-in-law back in a good humor. And when her nephew breaks his collarbone, she calls the doctor, she stays with the kids. So even though we very much see her in the book as downtrodden, when I went back to look at it, I'm like, she's actually very competent. She just doesn't have much of an outlet for it beyond smoothing everything in the background. So I thought, for a modern woman with this hyper level of competency who takes care of so much, that could express itself in a career. So I gave her career and she's hyper competent. But as the book goes on, I tried to also show that in the same way in the original Persuasion, everyone kind of takes Anne for granted and her competency is kind of overlooked. It's just assumed Anne will fix everything. I tried to make it that way in her career as well. So she comes in very forceful and in charge, but over time you see that she's really gotten a life of her own. She's there to serve everyone else. She's there to fix everyone else's problems. Any problems at work, just come and dump it on Anne, which is kind of how I see her going through the original novel. And it's kind of, accepted until that famous scene when Louisa falls off the wall and cracks her head and everyone's kind of stunned. And then Anne's immediately, okay, we need a doctor, we need this, we need that. and she takes charge. And it's the first time everyone kind of looks up and says, "Oh, Anne's in charge." So I tried to play it out that same way. It's almost like a sneaky competence, but for modern times, she would have more outlet for it. But I tried to keep the core qualities of Anne, very, very focused on her internal monologue, very diplomatic, very considered with her words, always kind of biting her tongue and treating people in a very gentle fashion. So I tried to keep all those elements, very intelligent, very competent, but just in a modern world, she would have this career and this competency would reach new levels.
That's so interesting. And I think it really shines through that. And you're right, Anne Elliot in the original Persuasion is a very competent person, and everybody just takes it for granted. And now in this modern retelling, she is a super successful, competent person with all these different jobs and all of these different things that are pulling responsibilities that pull her in all these different directions. But she doesn't take care of herself. And it is interesting to me is she never took care of herself after her breakup 8 years ago. Tell me a little bit about the Heartbroke playlist and why you use that as a tool to help Anne become herself or rediscover herself.
It's funny because when I first started writing and I put that element in, the Eras tour was not happening yet. I had no idea, starting at the better, that it would blow up and be such a thing when the novel came out. I was like, all right, that's nice timing. Um, it, it was part of my plan to, again, for me, the main obstacle was I've got two romantic leads who are not romantic with each other and not talking to each other and not interacting with each other, which works really well in a movie where you can have subtle glances and things like that. Harder to do in a book. So it was part of kind of fill the space. I got a lot of small town characters. I've got rogue wildlife. I've got Anne's job, fill the space, fill the space. But I didn't want to take it too far into comedy, like pure rom-com, heaviness on the com, right? Everything's happening because Persuasion is very bittersweet. It's really quite tender and painful and just exquisitely done. So I wanted a way to kind of, again, fill the space, give more activity to Anne's heartbreak, but bring her something that is sets the tone differently with some of Taylor Swift's heartbreak songs. At the time, I did not know I couldn't use the lyrics. That's a copyright thing. So I kind of left it as a bit of a mystery. You've got to hunt down the song and see what lyric I'm talking about. But what really put it in my head, it was there's one particular song she has. I think it's from a number of years ago. And I don't think it was ever one of her particularly popular ones. But there's one particular lyric where it says, "I am the careful daughter of a careless father." And it's about a woman who has trouble trusting in romance. And so I thought, the careful daughter of a careless father. That is Anne Elliot to a T, right? She had a mother who loved her, but she's got these terrible sisters and this terrible father, and the whole family's self-absorbed and reckless and spendthrifts. And Anne is so considered and thoughtful and cautious and pragmatic. Because a lot of people, can dismiss that she originally turned down Captain Wentworth because he wasn't rich enough. Well, there was a lot of considerations when I go back to the original text. There was a war on. She was worried that him being married so early in his career would drag him down. There'd be concerns, And they do have this line that that just quietly, Jane Austen's so subtle. This line that he made money quickly, but he spent money quickly. So a very young Captain Wentworth is a little bit of a spendthrift himself, and we see the problems that come out with Anne's father with that. So I love that Taylor Swift lyric of "I'm the careful daughter of a careless," or sorry, it's "you fell in love with the careful daughter of a careless father." Something like that. I'm going to mangle it now because I've read it so many times, but something to that effect. And so I'm like, that's perfect. And so I thought that's going to be kind of the thesis of my novel. And then I thought, what the heck? Let's keep going on this theme. Let's throw some more Taylor Swift in there. And I just kind of went through a lot of my favorite songs, and not necessarily that the whole song applies to Anne, but one or two lyrics, chorus, a verse. There's a piece here, a piece there. And I thought it kind of weaved it through the book to tell the eloquent story of Anne's heartbreak in a way that just doesn't always have Anne internal monologuing on her heartbreak. Because I thought, that's going to be a real downer of a novel if it's all the time. But I did want to add that bittersweet element to it. So I thought if I pulled these lyrics And then it just also gives this other element that, in the original novel, Anne really is suffering in silence. But in this modern novel, I've given her one friend who has some idea of what happened, and her friend is the one who puts together this Taylor Swift playlist for her.
And I think is your Anne is kind of doesn't really understand it at first. And then as the novel develops and as she develops as a character, she's listening to it on repeat, falling asleep to it at her desk while she's overcommitting to everything. She's listening to it on her in her earbuds and falling asleep to it, which is really funny, but and very something that I think a lot of people can identify with because that's the type of thing that you would do. Those hyper competent people would do. They would fall asleep at their desk, and everybody I think has fallen asleep with their earbuds. uh,
Absolutely, absolutely.
Anne doesn't drink except for one holiday beverage, buttered rum, which I don't blame her. It's delicious. Tell me about some of your reasons why she doesn't drink. Is it just a narrative thing? Is something that Ben knows and not a lot of other people know, or that identifies him as somebody who knew her well once, or is it deeper as a character, as part of her character traits?
With kind of all those things, you struck upon it. That originally, why I put it in is because I wanted Ben to know something about her, Wentworth to know something about her that not many other people know, and that she's almost been covering for years. And I liked just the ironic idea of she's surrounded by wineries and Anne doesn't drink. So how long is she keeping up the pretense that she drinks and that Ben secretly knows she does not drink? But I also wanted to make it another expression of Anne's character again because she's so controlled in the original novel. Like she never speaks out of turn. She never expresses herself. It's how she's able to hide the fact that she's heartbroken through an entire novel, really. And again, with our modern times, we don't really have that level of societal restraint. We don't have that like ironclad politeness and very strict rules for socializing and things like that. So even though I have her pull in a lot, I wanted another element that just shows she's very self-controlled, and always kind of self-aware and always very meticulous about how she's coming across to others and things like that. So the idea of, we all have a drink and we loosen up a little bit. Anne doesn't do that. Anne's got that locus of control all the time. So that's how it expresses itself in modern times.
Mm-hmm.
And then I give her one drink at the end when she finally does, she can finally let go of that ironclad persona a little bit and relax and acknowledge that she's still in love with Wentworth and try to do something about that. So that's her one drink is kind of a signal of that.
What's interesting to me is that her father, you describe him as not the normal type of alcoholic, but he's an alcoholic. He drinks like every day. He reminds me of a little bit of the judge from Caddyshack, and that he is involved in all of these things, and he thinks he's the king of society, like the leader of society in Niagara upon the Lake. But he really just drinks every day, all the time, and then relies on poor Anne to bail him out when his credit card gets declined.
Yeah, I wanted to make the father like not repellent, but what do you think of the father in the original one? Like,
Oh, he's such an arrogant putz. He he doesn't think anything of Anne. It's very funny because he never expects her to get married, but he expects his older daughter, who is the opposite of Anne, who is very much like her father. He expects her to get married, even though she's like 31 at the time. He is not a self-possessed person, and he doesn't realize the type of harm that he has caused his entire family by being the type of person, the spendthrift type of person that he is. So I feel like in your book, Mr. Elliot is is a bit like that, but he's also being much more public about his failures uh, than the original character. Would you think that that's
Yeah,
similar?
no, that's a good comparison actually. Um, I'm always interested to see what people think of the original characters versus mine and kind of the overlap of the differences. But you've nailed it. So he's and that's a detail that always bugs me too that people miss it. Elizabeth, the older sister, who is older, is expected to get married and still on the market and flirting and thinks well of her chances. And Anne, who's younger, is on the shelf, which really just tells you it's so much about how they are viewed and how they are positioned. Sir Eliot in the original novel, you're right. He has no idea of the damage he's done. He's terrible. He's harmful and hurtful with every word. And yet he's still somewhat funny because he's so pompous. Like, even though he's so incredibly damaging, it's almost like, well, it's not malicious. He's just pardon my language, he's a dumbass. Like, what are you gonna do? Um, and in the original novel, again, you've got those wonderful Jane Austen manners. So she really played up that he's so self-obsessed with class. And there are moments when he's really quite embarrassing when he betrays that love of class, when he's, even in the beginning when he's dismissive of, oh, someone from the Navy renting my home. And, when we can't invite these kinds of people to our party in Bath, and we're going to this kind of party. And even though we do have obviously class distinctions nowadays, they're not so readily apparent in our manners. So I wanted to give him another feature that made him really embarrassing, but in a very modern way. And I thought alcoholism, again, because the wineries are everywhere, and Anne doesn't drink. So you have those nice studies in polar opposites, because Anne is very accepting of everyone in the novel. She doesn't have that class snobbery. But it kind of clashed a little bit with Mr. Eliot's character because he's very, very vain. And alcoholics are usually, sloppy and messy and fall down. So I tried to kind of walk this line where he drinks too much, but in drinking too much, he exposes just what a ridiculous jerk he is. It's all his worst characteristics, and that he's leaving unpaid tabs all over town and he's getting kicked out. And he thinks he's so eloquent, as you said, king of society. And actually, he's a massive embarrassment. And so I wanted to do that to try and mimic how he's, even though Lady Russell and other people think highly of him because he's Sir Eliot, a lot of people in the novel are kind of looking askance at him in the same way, Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice is always cringing when her mother opens her mouth or Lydia opens her mouth. And so I just wanted a very modern and loud way to do that, which was giving him the alcoholism, but not to go so far into alcoholism that you're making light of a serious addiction, but just one that it's showing his character flaws.
I think it does a really good job of showing those flaws as being a public embarrassment, but private enough that all of these bartenders, they just know Anne's cell phone number and they call her whenever he acts up or his credit card is declined. I wanted to get into the romance. Tell me about the process of, you said throwing Anne and Wentworth together was hard because in the modern days, if you don't want to see your ex, you don't have to see your ex. It's not like you're going to be both, you have to invite him as a close family friend to all of your dinner parties, or he's a friend of your close friend and you're going to get thrown together a lot. But tell me about how Anne's changes in her own life allow her to deal with the breakup with him and then allows them to come back together, because it seems like neither of them ever really dealt with this breakup.
Well, in the original novel, they say Wentworth kind of admits he never dealt with it. He says just like hurt and pride for 8 years suppressed, right? Which I think is probably possibly a very male way to do it. Just, we're going to take those feelings and shove them down and go on pure pride that it didn't hurt me. I'm fine. I never really loved her. It's all good. And obviously that's very untrue. And for Anne, I gave her this calamitous event right after with her mother's illness so that she didn't really have time to deal with it. But also, Austen's so smart in that she's given them these 7 to 8 years, which is almost hard to think, will love last that long when it was such a short period in their youth. But it's so smart because it was such a deep love. And so there's really kind of this confusion as to why did it end? Why did Anne break it off? And Wentworth has this whole thing of they were snobby and she listened to Lady Russell and not to me. She was just persuaded. But when you get into it, Anne's reasons are really a lot more complex. Like in the book, original book, she's 19. It's very young to know how the rest of her life is, and like those considerations. They're at war. He has a dangerous profession. He's got hints of being a spendthrift. And nowadays we really wouldn't be so hung up on finances because we'd say, well, Anne can go out and earn her own and establish a home on the mainland while he's out at sea. But women back then couldn't do that. She's very, very reliant on the care of her husband. So it's a really scary thing to sign yourself over to that care back then. So when I went into this novel, I wanted to Anne to again have kind of shut it down because her mother illness came so quickly after and she didn't really deal with it, but also needing the maturity to understand, pick out her reasons of why she did it, because she's not entirely, everyone says it's tragic. She turned him down and they could have been together all those years. She's not entirely wrong for turning him down. She wasn't entirely right, but she wasn't entirely wrong. This is a case of it was a very hard decision and she had genuine concerns, and allowing herself to say, I did have genuine concerns, but maybe I could have handled it better. Or, maybe I could have not let those fears lead into those concerns. There's no right answer. And what I love in the original novel is when her and Wentworth kind of like hash it all out and explain, this is how I felt, this is how you felt, which they weren't able to do in the original breakup because they were both so hurt and devastated. It's almost like they couldn't logically explain their feelings. It's just pure emotion, which is, again, understandable when you're 19 with your first big breakup. So now that they're older and there's some time, they can say, logically parse it out, like, this is how I felt, this is how you felt. And what I love in the original novel is Wentworth said, okay, so if I had come back 2 years after you'd broken up with me and I'd had the promotion and I had this money saved and I was a little bit wiser and a little bit more mature and a little bit more financially steady, would you have said yes? And she's like, well, yes, I would have said yes. I would have been 21, legal age, like not 19, beholden to my Lady Russell, who was still my mother figure. So there could have been a fix only 2 years after the breakup. And it's the high emotionality that kept them apart for 8. So it's not like the breakup was wrong because there was an easy fix not long after. And so it's all this emotionality that made that little breakup a massive tragedy in both their lives. So at the end, I really wanted Anne Wentworth coming back into her life is taking stock of her life and saying, how did I end up in this position? Again, everyone's relying on me. Her job is so busy, it almost keeps her distracted from what her personal life is. And for her to stop and say, okay, what actually happened in that breakup? Why did I make those decisions? And I made those decisions because of my father, because of this way my life was headed. And then to say, wait a minute, I didn't actually prevent anything. I'm still in this life with this father and that. So my breakup with him didn't accomplish what it was supposed to. And what it did accomplish is that Wentworth went in a totally different direction, wanted to prove himself, prove that Anne was wrong about him. And so he's come back actually a much better guy. So now there's the opportunity to mature people say, okay, how does this work? And I think it's interesting because so often in the Austen novels, the hero is deeply flawed and then kind of goes away and works on himself and comes back better. And we see that with Mr. Darcy. Mm-hmm. Clear-cut case. He proposes, she says, these are all your flaws. And he goes away. It's like, he's very upset. And he goes, right, I can work on that. And again, Mr. Darcy's slightly older. So again, a little bit of that, more of that calm. He's a little more controlled than the young, dashing Captain Wentworth who's out for adventure. And you also see it in Mansfield Park when Fanny rejects Henry Crawford. And Henry Crawford, although he's kind of the villain of the piece, does go away and work on himself. Like he does go away and say, right, she, chewed me out because I'm not tending to my tenants. Right, she chewed me out because I'm a flirt. She's got this brother who needs a promotion. Maybe I can help him out. Oh, I have to address her much more gently, much more courteously. And he really is working on himself. And there's that hint almost that he's going to come back and get Fanny, but he succumbs to temptation and goes off and has the affair, right? So you have all these gentlemen in Austen's novels who are like, right, here's my flaws. And then it's how do they handle that flaw list? Darcy fixed it. Crawford tried and succumbed. Wentworth had to go away and think about it for 8 years. But he's come back with a lot of the fixes now, right?
Right.
So I just love that theme that she has of, and that also a lot of the females in her book have to go work on themselves. Elizabeth Bennet was too judgmental. She was too quick to judge. She was too easily flattered by Wickham. So Anne, yes, she was persuaded. Maybe she was overcautious, but that doesn't mean her concerns were without validity, right? So they both have to be fair to each other there and work on themselves.
Do you think Mrs. Elliot, before she gets sick, she warns Anne of it, against Wentworth. And Anne at the end realizes why that was, because she doesn't want her daughter to get stuck with a man like Mr. Elliot. Do you think that was a valid experience, being married to this foolish, overly proud man, jaded herself, or colored her judgment against a young, impulsive, but possibly much more driven man in Wentworth?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big changes I made where rather than having Lady Russell persuade Anne, I made it her mother just because I wanted someone a little close to home. And it's tough because in the original novel, Lady Russell like kind of doesn't like his manners. He's a bit rough. He's not of her set. And again, we don't maybe put that same emphasis on manners. So I wanted to delve deeper into the reasons, and really I got into why would Anne listen to this advice? And when you look at her family situation and how unhappy her mother was, I'm like, here's why. So I made it more direct that the mother is the one who looks at Wentworth and sees shades of her own husband who made her very unhappy, and how that would persuade Anne to see, like, look how this spendthrift, dashing man turns out when you need to pay the mortgage, which is a legitimate concern for someone who's older and wiser. But that she does misjudge Wentworth. Wentworth has some similarities, but he is not Anne's father. He's a much better man. He's much more driven. He's much better intentioned. He's much more caring. He's not so self-absorbed. But I wanted to kind of do that theme as well because, from what I remember, the whole thing of Jane Austen writing this was a niece writing to her for advice on a suitor, and Jane Austen writing back and saying, "No one can tell you what to do about a suitor. It's so personal." And so I wanted to make that kind of differentiation that her mother looking in is overlaying all her own fears over Anne's suitor, but no one but Anne and Wentworth in the relationship can really know what it's about. And even they did not really know each other well enough to be making those calls. And it's kind of that thing you have when you're young, like, I want to know how it turns out. I want to know that this is the correct path. I chose the right job. I chose the right boyfriend. And you don't really know. You can never really know how it's going to turn out, right?
Right.
So it's kind of that too, that you've got to take a leap of faith. You've got to balance your wisdoms and your pragmatism with taking a leap of faith. And her mother took that leap of faith, and it did not pan out. And so Anne did not take the leap of faith. And now 8 years later, she's got the opportunity to do it again. But it's absolutely her mother projecting her own fears, trying to protect her daughter, which I think is important too. When Lady Russell does the original novel, she means well. She's not just trying to separate them for cruelty's sake. She's not really being a huge snob. She genuinely thinks Anne can do better and that this is not a good relationship for her. So you've got to try and make it that it comes from a place of love, that they've made this erroneous kind of judgment on him.
I want to talk about two things: when people will be able to buy the book, and Double O Goose. So let's go.
February 27th. And Double O Goose, we have a real problem with Canadian geese here. I live next to a harbor. The geese are loud. They poop everywhere. I know they look very majestic on National Geographic, and they're on our coins here in Canada, but honestly, they're a menace. And just last week, traffic was stopped for 20 minutes on a road where I live because the geese decided to cross the road. They have wings. They can fly. They decided, all 50 of them, to slowly meander across the road to a little patch of grass. No one knows why. So I threw that in because geese were bothering me. And also because, again, I wanted a little comedy relief, and I wanted something that would be busy and upset things and draw them together and create some action.
Double O Goose is great. It's a ridiculously hilarious character, and I love him. He reminds me of the turkeys that we have around here that will chase people down the street in downtown Boston.
You know what I'm talking about? They hiss at you and stuff.
Running down the street from this 30-pound turkey, and you're like, really? And then it does it to you, and you're like, oh, that's why.
That is it. That is a Canadian goose. That's exactly how it goes. You think people get close and they're going to feed them, and then they start hissing and snapping, and you're like, nope, back away.
Well, thank you so much, Melodie, for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it. Again, February 27th, it'll be available in bookstores and on Amazon and online.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. That interview was so much fun, and I was provided with a press galley to read before the book was actually published, and I honestly do recommend it. It is a sweet, fun story about a woman who is finally taking charge of her life and making her own decisions. And now, let's get back to today's chapter. When we last left Eleanor and Marianne, Willoughby had just left the neighborhood with no return date, and Marianne went full emo. She was playing sad songs, she was taking lonely walks, sighing and muttering under her breath about people who understand her. All of that stuff that's expected from a member of the cult of sensibility. But Eleanor won't have it, and she forces Marianne to take a walk with her and Margaret. On the road, they see a man and servant riding towards them, and Marianne is sure it's Willoughby, even though he's 200 yards away, and despite Eleanor and Margaret both saying it doesn't look like him. Well, Marianne was wrong. The rider turns out to be Edward Ferrars, the shy, awkward brother of the Dashwood sister-in-law Fanny, and Eleanor's dream boy. Now, if you remember, Edward Ferrars was not recommended to their good opinion by any particular graces of person or address. He was not handsome, and his manners required intimacy to make them pleasing. He was too diffident to do justice to himself. Now, way back in chapter 3, Edward and Eleanor had started this very awkward and proper friendship before the Dashwoods left their once happy home at Norland for the little cottage in Devonshire. And as they never spoke about a relationship at all, but talked very politely to each other every day in the months after Eleanor's father died, while her brother and sister-in-law made themselves at home in Norland. Their relationship got to the point where Eleanor's evil sister-in-law Fanny confronted Mrs. D about how a poor girl like Eleanor would ruin her family's great expectations for Edward. And Mrs. D was so enraged that she just up and moved the whole family to Barton. So any possible plans for engagement were put on hold at that point, but he had promised Mrs. D that he would visit the family at some point. And now he's making good on that promise, as awkward and silent as ever. To the point that his melancholy is actually irritating Eleanor. We begin with Edward and the Dashwood girls arriving at Barton Cottage to visit Mrs. D. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised for only a moment at seeing him, for his coming to Barton was, in her opinion, of all things the most natural. Her joy and expression of regard long outlived her wonder. He received the kindest welcome from her. Shyness, coldness, and reserve could not stand against such a reception. They had begun to fail him before he entered the house, and they were quite overcome by the captivating manners of Mrs. Dashwood. Indeed, a man could not very well be in love with either of her daughters without extending the passion to her, and Eleanor had the satisfaction of seeing him soon become more like himself. His affection seemed to reanimate towards them all, and his interest in their welfare again became perceptible. He was not in spirits. However, he praised their house, admired its prospect, was attentive and kind, but he was still not in spirits. Now, Mrs. D has her faults, but she is a charming person who can make friends feel right at home. Even gloomy Edward can feel this, and he responds to her kind nature. But he's still not happy, and all of the Dashwoods can now perceive it. Mrs. D attributes it all to his mother, the cause, as she understands it, of all of Edward's misery. And why wouldn't she? She would have heard all about Mrs. Ferrars while she was still at Norland, and she's annoyed for Edward. Who wouldn't when they see their kid's friend so gloomy and believe that the reason is poor parenting? Mrs. Dashwood, attributing it to some want of liberality in his mother, sat down to table indignant against all selfish parents. "What are Mrs. Ferrars's views for you at present, Edward?" said she, when dinner was over and they had drawn round the fire. "Are you still to be a great orator in spite of yourself?" "No, I hope my mother is now convinced that I have no more talent than inclination for a public life." "But how is your fame to be established? For famous you must be to satisfy all your family. and with no inclination for expense, no affection for strangers, no profession, and no assurance, you may find it a difficult matter. I shall not attempt it. I have no wish to be distinguished, and have every reason to hope I never shall. Thank heaven, I cannot be forced into genius and eloquence. You have no ambition, I well know. Your wishes are all moderate. As moderate as those of the rest of the world, I believe. I wish, as well as everybody else, to be perfectly happy. But, like everybody else, it must be in my own way. Greatness will not make me so. Edward seems to say here that his mood isn't related to his mother's desire that he stand for Parliament and drive a barouche, and that she's rather over her demands at this point. All he wants is a normal, undistinguished life. And this is such a great line. I wish, as well as everybody else, to be perfectly happy. But like everybody else, it must be in my own way. If that is not a universal truth, I don't know what is. And then we ask, what does perfectly happy mean to the Dashwoods? Strange that it would, cried Marianne. What have wealth or grandeur to do with happiness? Grandeur has but little, said Eleanor, but wealth has much to do with it. Eleanor, for shame, said Marianne. Money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. Beyond a competence, it can afford no real satisfaction, as far as mere self is concerned. Perhaps, said Eleanor, smiling, we may come to the same point. Your competence and my wealth are very much alike, I dare say, and without them, as the world goes now, we shall both agree that every kind of external comfort must be wanting. Your ideas are only more noble than mine. Come, what is your confidence? About 1,800 or 2,000 a year, not more than that. Eleanor laughed. 2,000 a year? One is my wealth. I guessed how it would end. And yet 2,000 a year is a very moderate income, said Marianne. A family cannot well be maintained on a smaller. I am sure I am not extravagant in my demands. A proper establishment of servants, a carriage perhaps too, and hunters cannot be supported on less. Eleanor smiled again to hear her sister describing so accurately their future expenses at Combe Magna. Hunters, repeated Edward. Why must you have hunters? Everybody does not hunt. Marianne colored as she replied, but most do. Now we start to see what happiness means to each of the Dashwoods. To Marianne, it's a moderate income of about £2,000. In today's money, that would be about £371,860-ish pounds, or about $464,000. And that's considered a moderate income. It would be a very nice income today. And in the 1790s, the buying power would have been enormous. A pound today only buys about 0.53% of what it could in 1790. And what's interesting is if you look at the value of that income, a £2,000 income in 1790 would have the buying power of about £3,600,000, or $4,565,000 today. That's not a nice income. That's the income of some pro athletes. Meanwhile, Eleanor says £1,000 would suit her just fine. That is still a lot of money, and it's half of what Marianne considers comfort. But that yearly income would put Eleanor in the top 5% of families in England at that time. £1,000 would be equivalent to £185,930 in 2024, and the buying power is £1.8 million. So even though Eleanor says her needs are only half of what Marianne says needs to be happy, it's still a lot of money. And what is her mother living on right now? Her mother is trying to raise 3 daughters on only £500. But it's quite interesting that Marianne doesn't equate wealth and grandeur with happiness. While requiring so much wealth and grandeur for her perfect happiness, Many wealthy families had one carriage, but two was extravagant, and hunters refers to horses used only for fox hunting. And hunting was actually a favorite hobby of Jane Austen's oldest brother James, who had at least two hunters and regularly took part in hunts with his first father-in-law, General Edward Matthew. But it's a really expensive hobby, and James wasn't able to maintain that lifestyle for long. Marianne's preoccupation also shows the sentimentalist and romantic disdain for wealth, while taking advantage of their wealth. Writers like Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley described a disdain for wealth in much of their poetry, but they were both born to wealthy, land-owning, and titled families, so there's a teensy bit of irony there. It's interesting to compare how Jane is so critical of characters like John and Fanny Dashwood, who see money as the way to happiness, or at least the lack of it to miserliness. But she's showing that while Eleanor requires less money than her sister for wealth, her idea of a practical lifestyle still includes wealth. I would say that Jane never argues that an appreciation for money is a negative. But then Margaret is maybe more practical than both her sisters. I wish, said Margaret, striking out a novel thought, that somebody would give us all a large fortune apiece. Oh, that they would, cried Marianne, her eyes sparkling with animation and her cheeks glowing with the delight of such imaginary happiness. We are all unanimous in that wish, I suppose, said Eleanor, in spite of the insufficiency of wealth. Oh dear, cried Margaret, how happy I should be. I wonder what I should do with it. Marianne looked as if she had no doubt on that point. I should be puzzled to spend so large a fortune myself, said Mrs. Dashwood, if my children were all to be rich without my help. You must begin your improvements on this house, observed Eleanor, and your difficulties will soon vanish. It is these little family jokes and teasings that bring the Dashwoods to life for me, and this is what Austen does so well. She makes her characters into real people. You see Mrs. D and Eleanor happy to imagine and tease, while Marianne, the unjoking dreamer, takes this idea seriously and doesn't seem to notice that everyone else is laughing at her a little bit. And this is a dream that even Edward can get into. What magnificent orders would travel from this family to London, said Edward, in such an event. What a happy day for booksellers, music sellers, and print shops. You, Miss Dashwood, would give a general commission for every new print of merit to be sent you, and as for Marianne, I know her greatness of soul. There would be not music enough in London to content her. And books, Thomson, Cowper, Scott, she would buy them all over and over again. She would buy up every copy, I believe, to prevent their falling into unworthy hands. And she could have every book that tells her how to admire an old twisted tree. Should you not, Marianne? Forgive me if I am very saucy, but I was willing to show you that I had not forgot our old disputes. Now we finally see Edward starting to warm up and just be himself and help the Dashwoods with some good old-fashioned Marianne teasing. She would spend all of her money at music sellers for sheet music and, of course, booksellers where she would probably buy specially bound copies of all three of these poets. Now, I want to sidebar for just a minute or two and talk about these poets. We know one of them, William Cowper, spelled Cowpr, but pronounced Cooper. He wrote The Task, a poem in blank verse that's unrhymed, which we read way back in episode 3, when Marianne makes poor Edward read Cooper to them, and then complains that his recital isn't expressive enough. And if you want to know more about how Cooper influenced Jane Austen, then you could definitely go take a listen to episode 3. We'll wait. Edward's second name drop is James Thomson, and he was alive from 1700 to 1748. He was a Scottish poet and playwright known for his poems The Seasons and The Castle of Indolence. and for the lyrics of the most patriotic British song I have ever heard, Rule Britannia. Thomson spent most of his adult life in England, and an intermingling of Scottish and English tradition is embodied in his work according to what I've read about him. I'll read a stanza from Summer, which was published in 1727, 2 years after he arrived in London. The poem is in blank verse and is part of the Seasons poem cycle. When now no more than alternate twins are fired, and Cancer reddens with the solar blaze, short is the doubtful empire of the night. And soon observant in approaching day, the meek-eyed morn appears, mother of dews, at first faint gleaming in the dappled east, till far o'er ether spreads the widening glow. And from the lustre of her face, white breaks the clouds away, with quickened step, brown night retires, young day pours in apace, and opens all the lawny prospects wide. The dripping rock, the mountain's misty top, swell on the sight and brighten with the dawn. Blue through the dusk the smoking currents shine, and from the bladed field the fearful hare limps awkward, while along the forest glade the wild deer trip, and often turning gaze at early passenger music awaits. The native voice of undissembled joy in thick around the woodland hymns arise. Roused by the cock, the soon-clad shepherd leaves his mossy cottage, where with peace he dwells, and from the crowded fold in order drives his flock to haste the verdure of the morn. I've linked the entire poem in the episode notes. It's definitely something that Marianne would like. Finally, Scott. That's Sir Walter Scott, probably the most well-known poet and author to modern readers. He was a Scottish writer who wrote mainly historical novels. You've probably heard of Ivanhoe if you haven't read it. And he also wrote the narrative poem, The Lady of the Lake, which is a 6-canto poem telling the story of James V's struggle against James Douglas in the affections of 3 suitors towards James Douglas's daughter Ellen. Here's a selection from that poem. The rose is fairest when 'tis budding new, and hope is brightest when it dawns from fears. The rose is sweetest washed with morning dews, and love is loveliest when embalmed in tears. O wilding rose, whom fancy thus endears, I bid your blossoms in my bonnet wave, emblem of hope and love through future years. Thus spoke young Norman, heir of Armandave, what time the sun rose on Venechar's broad wave. Scott was actually a contemporary of Jane Austen, although about 15 years her senior, and they actually shared a publisher, John Murray, who published Emma. But what's kind of funny here is that while Scott was beginning to work as an editor in the 1790s, he didn't publish his first poem, Glenfinlas, until 1800. So Marianne's adoration of him could be a little out of context for the time setting, but that's okay. So why does Edward name drop these 3 poets? Well, I think it's their descriptions of the natural world. Their poetry is so evocative and vivid, and nature is either the theme of their poems or its wild beauty is used as a metaphor, as I hope that you can see from these examples. These are 3 poets who would have definitely been on the library shelves at Norland when they weren't in Marianne's hands. Now, let's get back to the text. I love to be reminded of the past, Edward, whether it be melancholy or gay. I love to recall it. And you would never offend me by talking of former times. You are very right in supposing how my money would be spent. Some of it, at least, my loose cash, would certainly be employed in improving my collection of music and books. And the bulk of your fortune would be laid out in annuities on the authors or their heirs. No, Edward, I should have something else to do with it. Perhaps, then, you would bestow it as a reward on that person who wrote the ablest defense of your favorite maxim, that no one can ever be in love more than once in their life. For your opinion on that point is unchanged, I presume. Undoubtedly, at my time of life opinions are tolerably fixed. It is not likely that I should now see or hear anything to change them. Marianne is as steadfast as ever, you see, said Eleanor. She is not at all altered. She has only grown a little more grave than she was. Nay, Edward, said Marianne, you need not reproach me. You are not very gay yourself. Why should you think so? Replied he with a sigh. But gaiety was never a part of my character. Nor do I think it was a part of Marianne's, said Eleanor. I should hardly call her a lively girl. She is very earnest, very eager in all she does, sometimes talks a great deal, and always with animation, but she is not often really merry. I believe you are right, he replied, and yet I have always set her down as a lively girl. I have frequently detected myself in such kind of mistakes, said Eleanor, in a total misapprehension of character in some point or other, fancying people so much more gay or grave, or ingenious or stupid than they really are, and I can hardly tell why or in what the deception originated. Sometimes one is guided by what they say of themselves, and very frequently what other people say of them, without giving oneself time to deliberate and judge. All right, let's stop here for a second. What do you think Marianne would spend the bulk of her 2,000-pound fortune on? Hunters, maybe? Is 2,000 pounds enough to secure Willoughby? And isn't Marianne a lively girl? Now let's compare her to another Austen heroine who is definitely lively. Elizabeth Bennet is playful, witty, and always has an opinion, and like her father, delights in the ridiculous and in ridiculing people. And what about other characters? Well, there's Mr. Bingley. He is also called lively and unreserved. Anyways, I think the difference between these two characters and Marianne is their merriment of character. Both Elizabeth and Bingley are just there for the vibes, whether it be a ball, a dinner, or some other activity. Neither of them is a very serious person. They would rather joke and play and have a good time. It's why both of them are so good for Darcy, who's shy and withdrawn and can be way too serious. So what about Marianne? She's as animated and vivacious as Elizabeth, but she's not funny. She never cracks a joke. She doesn't appreciate Eleanor's jokes and doesn't always seem to realize when she's being made fun of. Kind of like here. She's passionate, serious, and definitely not lively. And Eleanor knows this. What she says here is so interesting. She says she sometimes misjudges people. But does she really misjudge people? I think that's something we'll come back to throughout the novel. But I think she's saying this here because of how Edward is acting, and she doubts his character and the way she feels about him based on these changes she's perceiving in him. She is mistrusting her judgment of Edward, and if she misjudged him, who else has she misjudged? Willoughby? Brandon? Mrs. Jennings? Who knows? She's wondering out loud in that gorgeous subtext that Austen uses whether her entire way of looking at the world is skewed because the man she thought might love her is acting like an iceberg. Of course, Marianne, as usual, isn't picking up what Eleanor is putting down. But I thought it was right, Eleanor, said Marianne, to be guided wholly by the opinion of other people. I thought our judgments were given us merely to be subservient to those of neighbors. This has always been your doctrine, I'm sure. No, Marianne, never. My doctrine has never aimed at the subjection of the understanding. All I have ever attempted to influence has been the behavior. You must not confound my meaning. I am guilty, I confess, of having often wished you to treat our acquaintances in general with greater attention. But when have I advised you to adopt their sentiments or to conform to their judgment in serious matters? This is really interesting. Marianne believes she should entirely be guided by other people's opinions. Is this something a girl of sensibility should believe, or is it something a gullible teenager would think? I'm not really sure, and I would love to hear what other people think about this. Anyways, to get back to the text, you have not been able to bring your sister over to your plan of general civility, said Edward to Eleanor. Do you gain no ground? Quite the contrary, replied Eleanor, looking expressively at Marianne. My judgment, he returned, is all on your side of the question, but I am afraid my practice is much more on your sister's. I never wish to offend, but I am so foolishly shy that I often seem negligent when I am only kept back by my natural awkwardness. I have frequently thought that I must be intended by nature to be fond of low company. I am so little at my ease among strangers of gentility. Marianne has not shyness to excuse any attention of hers, said Eleanor. She knows her own worth too well for false shame, replied Edward. Shyness is not the effect of a sense of inferiority in some way or other. If I could only persuade myself that my manners were perfectly easy and graceful, I should not be shy. But you would still be reserved, said Marianne, and that is worse. Edward started. Reserved? Am I reserved, Marianne? Yes, very. I do not understand you, replied he, coloring. Reserved? How? In what manner? What am I to tell you? What can you suppose? Eleanor looked surprised at his emotion, but trying to laugh off the subject, she said to him, Do not you know my sister well enough to understand what she means? Do not you know she calls everyone reserved who does not talk as fast and admire what she admires as rapturously as herself? Edward made no answer. His gravity and thoughtfulness returned on him in their fullest extent, and he sat for some time silent and dull. Why is Edward blushing over being called reserved? He is totally acting reserved, to the point that Eleanor kind of wants to smack him. He is not a lively person either, but he's always courteous and gentlemanly. But today he's just a stick in the mud. Do you think he was hiding his feelings? If so, he should never play poker because he'd lose his shirt. And why is he trying to hide his feelings? What does he have to hide? And why was he in Plymouth in the first place? Could his visit have something to do with this attitude? There are so many questions about Edward's demeanor and the reasons behind it. I suppose we'll have to continue reading to find out. But that is all for today. Thank you for listening to Ents and Sensibility. Today's episode was written and edited by me, Casey Meserve. You can listen to all the episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or rating on Spotify. Those really help other people find podcasts they might enjoy. You can write to me at entsandsensibility@gmail.com and follow Ents and Sensibility on Facebook and on Instagram. And if you'd like to purchase any of the books mentioned today on the show, check out the bookshelf page on entsandsensibility.com. We also have show notes on every show and so much more. Thank you, and I hope you'll listen again soon.